The alarm screamed across RAF Fairford at 14:32 on what had started as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. In the underground command center, a young European woman named Elaine Thompson stood before a missile launch console, her finger hovering over controls that could change the course of history. Just 6 months earlier, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She'd been dismissed as nothing more than a base visitor, someone who didn't belong, someone who would never understand the complexities of military operations. Now, as enemy aircraft breached British airspace for the first time in decades, she was the only person on base qualified to operate the experimental defense system that could stop them. This is the story of how the woman they called just a visitor became the one person in Air Force pilot trusted to launch the missiles that would save them all. Elaine Thompson arrived at RAF Fairford on a crisp September morning, her visitor's badge catching the sunlight as she walked across the tarmac. At 23, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood complex systems. But her civilian clothes and temporary access card immediately marked her as an outsider in a world of uniforms and rigid hierarchy. Royal Air Force Base buzzed with its usual morning activity. Fighter jets screamed overhead during training exercises. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, and officers strode purposefully between buildings that housed some of Britain's most advanced military technology. Elaine watched it all with fascination, her analytical mind already cataloging the intricate coordination required to keep such an operation running smoothly. She was here as part of a civilian contractor program, her expertise in advanced computing systems deemed valuable enough to warrant temporary clearance. Her company, Cambridge Defense Technologies, had developed sophisticated software for the base's new experimental missile defense network, a system so classified that even most of the military personnel on base didn't know its full capabilities. Elaine's role was supposed to be simple: provide technical support for the software installation, answer questions about system parameters, and ensure the transition from development to operational status went smoothly. She was, in every official sense, just visiting. Her badge said "Contractor Escort Required" in bold red letters, a constant reminder that she didn't truly belong in this world of national security and military precision. Wing Commander Harrison Mills greeted her at the main security checkpoint, his expression polite but distant. He was the kind of career officer who believed that military operations should be handled by military personnel, and civilian contractors were a necessary evil, to be tolerated rather than embraced. "Ms. Thompson," he said, checking her credentials with meticulous care, "you'll be working primarily with our technical staff in Building C. Your escort will be Sergeant Davies. He'll ensure you have access to the systems you need while maintaining appropriate security protocols." Elaine nodded, understanding the subtext. She would be watched, guided, and kept within carefully defined boundaries. Her expertise was welcome, but her presence was temporary and her access limited. Sergeant Davies, a friendly but professional man in his 30s, led her through the maze of corridors that connected the base's various facilities. As they walked, he explained the basic layout, the security procedures, and the expectations for civilian contractors. "The missile defense system you'll be working on is housed in the underground command center," he explained as they descended into the bunker-like facility. "It's our newest and most sophisticated defensive capability. Very few people have clearance to access it directly." The command center was impressive. Banks of monitors displayed real-time data about airspace activity. Radar sweeps painted green arcs across dark screens, and rows of workstations hummed with electronic activity. At the center of it all stood the Missile Defense Console, a sophisticated array of displays and controls that looked like something from a science fiction film. "That's your baby," Davies said, pointing to the console. "The software your team developed is what makes it all work. Without that program, it's just expensive hardware." Elaine approached the console with professional interest, her eyes scanning the interface that her team had spent 2 years perfecting. She'd run thousands of simulations, tested countless scenarios, and debugged every line of code. But seeing it installed in its operational environment gave her a thrill of pride mixed with responsibility. The technical staff welcomed her politely, but maintained a clear distinction between her role and theirs. She was there to answer questions about the software, not to operate the system. That responsibility belonged to trained military personnel who understood the weight of decisions that could affect national security. As the day progressed, Elaine found herself answering routine questions about system configurations and user interfaces. The work was straightforward, but she couldn't help noticing inefficiencies in how the staff approached certain procedures. Her software had capabilities they weren't utilizing, shortcuts they didn't know existed, and diagnostic tools they'd never been trained to use. She offered suggestions tentatively, couching them in technical language that wouldn't seem presumptuous. Some were received well, others politely dismissed. The message was clear. She was there to support, not to innovate or improve upon established procedures. The dismissal started subtly, woven into polite conversations and professional interactions that left Elaine feeling increasingly isolated, despite being surrounded by people. During her second week at RAF Fairford, she attended her first operational briefing, not as a participant, but as an observer, seated in the back row while uniformed personnel discussed scenarios that directly involved the system she'd helped create. Flight Lieutenant Sarah Chun stood at the front of the briefing room, pointing to a tactical display that showed potential threat vectors. "The missile defense system gives us unprecedented capability to intercept incoming threats," she explained to the assembled officers. "Response time is critical. From threat identification to missile launch, we need to maintain a window of less than 90 seconds. Elaine listened with growing concern. The briefing described procedures that were technically correct, but inefficient, following protocols that added unnecessary steps to what should be a streamlined process. Her software included automated threat assessment algorithms that could cut response time by 30%, but the operators were manually verifying data that the system had already analyzed with greater accuracy than human observation could achieve. She raised her hand tentatively. "Excuse me, Flight Lieutenant Chun. I believe the system includes automated verification protocols that could accelerate the response process." The room turned to look at her, and Elaine felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her right to speak. Chun's expression remained professional, but her tone carried a subtle edge. "Miss Thompson, we appreciate your technical input, but operational procedures are developed based on military doctrine and real-world experience. The automated systems are excellent as support tools, but human verification remains essential for decisions of this magnitude." Wing Commander Mills nodded approvingly. "Exactly right. We can't rely entirely on computer algorithms when lives are at stake. The human element provides judgment that no software can replicate." Elaine wanted to explain that her algorithms incorporated exactly that kind of judgment, that they'd been trained on thousands of scenarios, including many that human operators might never encounter. But the polite dismissal in Chun's voice made it clear that further discussion wasn't welcome. After the briefing, Sergeant Davies approached her with a sympathetic expression. "Don't take it personally," he said quietly. "They're good people, but they're trained to trust procedures over technology. It takes time to build confidence in new systems." The pattern continued throughout the following weeks. Elaine would identify potential improvements or point out overlooked capabilities, only to be thanked politely and reminded that operational decisions were made by qualified military personnel. Her suggestions were noted, filed, and forgotten. The most frustrating incident occurred during a training exercise. when the missile defense system experienced what the operators classified as a malfunction. Elaine watched from her designated observation area as technicians ran through troubleshooting procedures that she knew would take hours to complete. The diagnostic indicates a calibration error in the targeting array, announced Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, consulting a manual that was already 3 revisions behind the current software version. Elaine knew immediately what the problem was. A minor configuration issue that could be resolved in minutes if they accessed the right diagnostic menu. She approached Rodriguez carefully. "Sergeant, I think I can help identify the issue. The software includes diagnostic tools that might expedite the troubleshooting process." Rodriguez looked up from his manual, his expression mixing politeness with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but we have established procedures for system maintenance. These protocols have been tested and approved by command. I understand, but this particular issue is related to a software update that was implemented after those procedures were written. The diagnostic I'm suggesting would, Ms. Thompson." Wing Commander Mill's voice cut across the command center. "Perhaps you could assist Sergeant Davies with the documentation review instead. Let our trained personnel handle the operational troubleshooting." The dismissal stung because it was delivered with perfect military courtesy, making any protest seem unprofessional. Elaine walked back to her assigned workstation, watching as the troubleshooting process stretched into its 3rd hour. The issue that could have been resolved in 10 minutes would ultimately take the system offline for an entire day. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During lunch in the civilian contractor section of the base cafeteria, Elaine found herself sitting alone while military personnel clustered at tables throughout the main dining area. The physical separation reflected the social reality. She was a visitor in their world, tolerated but not truly accepted. She overheard conversations that reinforced her outsider status. "Nice enough girl," someone was saying about her. "Clearly knows her technical stuff, but she doesn't really understand how military operations work." Civilians always think they can improve things without understanding why procedures exist in the first place. The comment came from Flight Lieutenant Chun, who was speaking to a colleague at a nearby table. Her voice wasn't hostile, just matter of fact, stating what seemed to be obvious truth. "Exactly," her companion replied. "Software is one thing, but operational reality is completely different. You can't just optimize everything like it's a computer program. There are human factors, chain of command, accountability." She learned. Elaine stared down at her lunch, realizing that her attempts to be helpful were being interpreted as naive presumption. Her expertise in the very system that protected the base was being dismissed as irrelevant to its actual operation. She was the designer who wasn't trusted to understand her own creation. What the personnel at RAF Fairford didn't know was that Elaine Thompson had spent the last 18 months preparing for exactly this kind of operational environment. While her official role was software development, her personal obsession was understanding every aspect of how that software would be used in real-world scenarios. Every evening, after returning to her modest flat in Cirencester, Elaine transformed her spare bedroom into a replica command center. 3 monitors displayed real-time aerospace data feeds that she'd gained access to through legitimate research channels. Military aviation websites, declassified tactical manuals, and technical journals covered her desk in organized stacks. She'd memorized NATO response protocols, studied historical air defense engagements, and analyzed every publicly available case study of missile defense operations. Her colleagues at Cambridge Defense Technologies knew she was thorough, but they had no idea of the depth of her preparation. While they saw software development as a technical challenge to be solved, Elaine understood it as a life-or-death responsibility that required her to think like a military operator, not just a programmer, She'd spent countless hours in flight simulators at nearby civilian airports, learning to think in 3 dimensions about aircraft movement and threat assessment. The pilots who instructed her had no idea she was translating their lessons into algorithms that could one day defend British airspace. They simply saw an enthusiastic young woman with an unusual interest in aviation tactics. Her home setup included commercial radar simulation software that she'd modified to match the specifications of military systems. Every night, she practiced threat identification scenarios, testing her ability to distinguish between hostile aircraft and civilian traffic under various conditions. She knew the radar signatures of every aircraft in NATO inventories, could identify electronic warfare countermeasures by their signature patterns, and had memorized the flight characteristics of potential threat aircraft that might never appear. In official training materials, the most intensive preparation had begun 6 months ago when she'd realized that understanding the software wasn't enough. She needed to understand the human operators who would use it under stress. She'd enrolled in crisis management courses, studied decision-making psychology, and even taken a civilian emergency response certification course, where she'd learned to function effectively under extreme pressure. Her notebooks contained detailed analyses of every major air defense engagement of the past 20 years, with particular focus on split-second decisions that had determined success or failure. She'd identified patterns in operator errors, studied the psychology of target identification under time pressure, and developed mental frameworks for maintaining clarity during chaos. None of this preparation was officially required, or even known by her supervisors. Elaine had simply recognized that creating software for life or death situations carried a responsibility that extended beyond writing clean code. If her system failed because operators couldn't use it effectively under pressure, the fault would ultimately lie with her inadequate understanding of their needs. She'd also studied the specific geography around RAF Fairford with obsessive detail. She knew the radar coverage patterns, understood how local terrain affected detection capabilities, and had memorized the locations of every potential target within a 100-mile radius. Her software included geographic optimization features that she'd never mentioned in official documentation because she knew they exceeded the stated requirements. Most significantly, Elaine had prepared for scenarios that weren't included in official training protocols. Her background research had revealed classified information gaps in standard procedures, situations where multiple simultaneous threats, electronic warfare interference, or system degradation under combat conditions could create decision-making scenarios that existing protocols didn't address. Her home computer contained simulation programs that modeled these edge cases, allowing her to develop rapid response strategies for situations that military planners hoped would never occur. She'd practiced decision trees for simultaneous multi-vector attacks, signal degradation scenarios, and even partial system failures that would require operators to use her software in ways that weren't covered in the official manual. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was probably better trained on the operational use of the missile defense system than most of the military personnel who would operate it. But she also understood that this knowledge was meaningless if it wasn't recognized or respected by the people who needed it. Her preparation had taught her that successful air defense wasn't just about technology, it was about trust, communication, and split-second decision-making under impossible pressure. She'd studied enough military history to know that the most sophisticated systems in the world were worthless if operators couldn't use them effectively when it mattered most. Every evening, as she ran through simulation scenarios in her spare bedroom, Elaine wondered if her preparation would ever matter. She was training for situations that might never occur, developing expertise that might never be recognized, and preparing for responsibilities that might never be offered to someone with her civilian status. But she continued anyway, driven by the understanding that somewhere in the future, Lives might depend on decisions made by someone using software she'd created. If that moment ever came, she intended to be ready for it, regardless of whether anyone thought she should be. The depth of her preparation was her secret, a private obsession that she couldn't explain without sounding presumptuous or overambitious. So she continued learning, continued practicing, and continued preparing for a moment that everyone assured her would never come. The whispers began during Elaine's 4th week at RAF Fairford, subtle comments that questioned not her technical competence, but her understanding of her place within the base's hierarchy. It started with seemingly innocent observations that gradually coalesced into a narrative about civilian contractors who exceeded their boundaries. Thompson's been asking a lot of questions about operational procedures. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez mentioned to his supervisor during a routine equipment briefing. More than most contractors, she seems particularly interested in threat assessment protocols and response timing. His tone wasn't accusatory, just observational, but it planted a seed that began to grow throughout the technical staff. Why would a software developer need to understand combat procedures? What was the purpose of her detailed questions about scenarios that fell outside her area of responsibility? Flight Lieutenant Chun noticed it during a systems training session when Elaine asked about the integration between the missile defense system and the base's broader air traffic control network. The question demonstrated sophisticated understanding of military operations that seemed unusual for someone whose job was supposed to be purely technical support. She knows an awful lot about our procedures for someone who's only been here a month, Chun mentioned to Wing Commander Mills during their weekly briefing. I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate, but her level of interest in operational detail seems to exceed what's necessary for software support. Mills nodded thoughtfully. He'd noticed the same thing. Elaine's questions were consistently more detailed and strategically focused than those of other civilian contractors. Her curiosity about military doctrine and combat procedures struck him as professionally unnecessary and potentially concerning. The concern wasn't about security, breaches, or malicious intent. Elaine's background had been thoroughly vetted, and her security clearance was appropriate for her role. The issue was more subtle: a civilian contractor who seemed to be studying military operations with an intensity that suggested ambitions beyond her assigned responsibilities. Maybe she's just naturally curious, suggested Sergeant Davies when the topic came up during a security briefing. Some technical people are like that. They want to understand the whole system, not just their piece of it. But even Davies had begun to notice patterns in Elaine's behavior that seemed to go beyond natural curiosity. She arrived early and stayed late, spending time observing operations that weren't directly related to her software. She'd memorized personnel schedules, understood the base's daily rhythms, and demonstrated knowledge of procedures that weren't covered in civilian contractor briefings. The whispers grew more pointed when Corporal Jenkins mentioned seeing Elaine taking notes during an emergency drill that civilian contractors weren't supposed to observe. She was standing near the perimeter fence, watching the whole exercise and writing in that notebook she always carries, he reported. When she saw me, she put it away and walked back to the main building. This incident, though minor, crystallized growing concerns about boundary issues. The emergency drill had been routine training, nothing classified or sensitive, but civilian contractors were generally expected to remain in designated areas during military exercises. Elaine's observation suggested she was actively studying operations outside her purview. Wing Commander Mills began paying closer attention to Elaine's activities. He noticed that she'd somehow acquired detailed knowledge of the base's aircraft schedules, seemed to understand the significance of various alert levels, and demonstrated familiarity with personnel assignments that weren't related to her technical duties. I'm not questioning her loyalty or suggesting any security violations, Mills explained to his security officer. But her level of engagement with military operations seems excessive for a civilian contractor. It's creating questions about her focus and priorities. The security officer, Major Patricia Walsh, reviewed Elaine's access logs and found nothing inappropriate. She'd remained within authorized areas, accessed only approved systems, and followed all security protocols precisely. But Walsh also noted the pattern of behavior that had concerned others: extensive observation of operations, detailed questions about procedures, and demonstrated knowledge that exceeded her official role requirements. It's not uncommon, Walsh concluded in her report. Some civilian contractors develop what we call military envy. They become fascinated by operations they're not part of and start over-identifying with military culture. Usually harmless, but worth monitoring to ensure it doesn't affect their job performance or create unrealistic expectations about their role. The assessment was professional and measured, but it established an official narrative that would influence how Elaine's actions were interpreted. Her enthusiasm was being reframed as potential overreach, her preparation as inappropriate ambition, and her expertise as exceeding acceptable boundaries. The Whisper campaign reached its peak when Flight Lieutenant Chun discovered that Elaine had been accessing technical manuals for systems beyond her assigned project. The manuals were available through legitimate channels and contained nothing classified. But Chun questioned why a software developer needed to understand radar integration, weapons systems interfaces, and combat communications protocols. "She's studying our entire defensive network," Chun reported to Mills. "Not just the missile system she's supposed to support, but everything connected to it. Either she's planning some kind of comprehensive system optimization that nobody authorized, or she's developing expertise that goes far beyond her assigned role." Mills scheduled a meeting with Elaine to address these concerns directly. The conversation would be professional and courteous, but it would also establish clear boundaries about the scope of her responsibilities and the expectations for civilian contractor behavior. The Whisper campaign had succeeded in transforming her dedication from an asset into a potential problem that required management attention. Wing Commander Mills' office felt more like an interrogation room than a routine meeting space when Elaine arrived for her scheduled appointment on a gray Thursday morning. The formal summons had come through Sergeant Davies, delivered with an apologetic expression that suggested he knew the meeting wouldn't be pleasant. "Miss Thompson, please have a seat," Mills said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. His tone was professional, but carried an edge that immediately put Elaine on alert. Between them lay a folder containing what appeared to be detailed reports about her activities on base. "I wanted to discuss your role here at RAF Fairford and ensure we have a clear understanding of expectations," Mills began, opening the folder. "You've been with us for nearly 6 weeks now, and there have been some observations about your approach to the assignment." Elaine felt her stomach tighten. She'd sensed the growing scrutiny, but had hoped her technical competence would speak for itself. Now facing Mills' stern expression, she realized that her expertise was being viewed as a problem rather than an asset. "Sir, I hope my work has been satisfactory. I've completed all assigned tasks on schedule and provided technical support whenever requested." "Your technical work is exemplary," Mills acknowledged. "That's not the issue. The concern relates to the scope of your interest and activities while on base. Several personnel have noted that your engagement extends well beyond your assigned responsibilities." He consulted the folder, reading from what appeared to be a compiled list of observations. "You've been observed studying operational procedures unrelated to your software. You've requested access to technical manuals outside your area of responsibility. You've asked detailed questions about combat protocols during briefings where your role is supposed to be purely observational." Each point felt like an accusation. Elaine had thought she was being thorough and professional. Instead, she was being characterized as overstepping boundaries and exceeding her authority. "Sir, I believe that understanding the operational context helps me provide better technical support. If I understand how the software is used in real scenarios, I can better address issues and optimize performance. Mills leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanging. Ms. Thompson, we appreciate thoroughness, but there's a difference between understanding context and studying military operations, as if you were preparing for operational duties yourself. Your level of detailed knowledge about our procedures and capabilities goes well beyond what's necessary for software support. The conversation felt like a carefully scripted performance designed to establish clear boundaries without explicitly accusing her of wrongdoing. Mills continued reading from his notes, each observation adding to a picture of a civilian contractor who didn't understand her proper place in the military hierarchy. You've memorized personnel schedules, demonstrated detailed knowledge of aircraft capabilities, and shown familiarity with emergency procedures that aren't covered in civilian contractor briefings. This suggests a level of engagement that raises questions about your focus and priorities. Elaine realized that her months of preparation were being turned against her. The knowledge she'd worked so hard to acquire was being presented as evidence of inappropriate ambition rather than professional dedication. Sir, I'm committed to doing the best job possible. If my approach has been misunderstood, I'm willing to adjust my methods, but I don't believe thorough preparation should be considered a negative trait. Thorough preparation for what? Mills asked sharply. Your job is software support, not military operations. The question is why you're preparing for responsibilities that aren't yours and will never be yours. The words stung because they forced Elaine to confront the fundamental contradiction in her position. She had been preparing for operational scenarios, imagining herself in roles that military protocol would never allow her to fill. Her expertise was theoretical, her preparation was hypothetical, and her knowledge was irrelevant to her actual responsibilities. Ms. Thompson, I'm going to be very clear about expectations going forward, Mills continued. Your role here is to provide technical support for the software your company developed. That means answering questions about system operations, troubleshooting technical issues, and assisting with routine maintenance. It does not include studying military tactics, observing operational procedures unrelated to your system, or developing expertise in areas outside your assigned duties. He closed the folder with finality. I need your assurance that you'll focus exclusively on your assigned responsibilities and avoid activities that could be interpreted as exceeding your authority or preparation for roles that aren't appropriate for civilian contractors. Elaine felt a door closing, not just on her current activities, but on the possibility that her knowledge and preparation might ever matter. She was being officially relegated to a narrow technical role with explicit instructions to abandon the broader understanding she'd worked so hard to develop. I understand, sir, she replied, though understanding and agreeing were different things. I'll focus on technical support duties as defined. Good. I'm confident we can avoid any future misunderstandings about scope and expectations. As Elaine left Mills' office, she realized that the Whisper campaign had achieved its goal. Her dedication had been reframed as overreach, her preparation as inappropriate ambition, and her expertise as exceeding acceptable boundaries. She was being systematically pushed into a smaller and smaller box, told to limit herself to the narrow technical role that others had decided was appropriate for someone like her. That evening, she sat in her flat, staring at the simulation setup that had consumed so many months of her life. Part of her wanted to dismantle it all, to accept the limitations that had been placed on her and focus exclusively on the software support role that was deemed appropriate. Instead, she left everything exactly as it was. If today had taught her anything, it was that being ready wasn't just about opportunity. It was about survival in a system that was determined to minimize her potential contributions. She would comply with Mills' instructions, but she wouldn't abandon the preparation that might someday prove crucial. The alarm that shattered the quiet Tuesday afternoon at RAF Fairford wasn't part of any scheduled exercise. At 14:32, air traffic control detected multiple aircraft approaching British airspace from the northeast, flying in formation and refusing to respond to radio communications. Within minutes, what had started as a routine day became the first genuine threat to UK airspace in over 2 decades. Elaine was in Building C reviewing system logs when the base-wide alert sounded. Through the windows, she could see personnel running between buildings, aircraft being rapidly prepared for takeoff, and the controlled chaos that marked a transition from peacetime operations to active defense. Her first instinct was to head to the underground command center, where her missile defense system would be crucial to the base's response. All civilian contractors report to designated safe areas immediately, came the announcement over the base. Communication system. This is not a drill. All non-essential personnel evacuate operational areas. Sergeant Davies appeared at her workstation, his usually calm demeanor replaced by focused urgency. Elaine, I need to escort you to the civilian shelter. Security protocols require all contractors to be secured during active threats. But the missile defense system, Elaine protested. If there are problems with the software during actual operations, I should be available to provide technical support. The system is operational and our trained personnel can handle it, Davies replied, already moving toward the exit. Your safety is the priority right now. As they walked rapidly toward the designated shelter area, Elaine could hear radio communications crackling from handheld units carried by passing personnel. The fragments she caught painted a picture of escalating crisis, multiple unidentified aircraft, electronic warfare interference, and degraded radar capabilities due to sophisticated jamming systems. The civilian shelter was a reinforced basement area in the administration building, equipped with basic communications equipment and supplies for extended occupancy. 3 other contractors were already there, looking nervous and confused about the sudden transition from routine work to potential combat operations. What's happening out there? Asked Dr. Margaret Foster, a communication system specialist, who'd been working on routine maintenance projects. Appears to be multiple aircraft approaching UK airspace, Davies explained as he secured the shelter area. Could be a navigation error, could be a probe of our defenses, could be something more serious. Either way, we're responding according to established protocols. Elaine positioned herself near the communication console, listening to the fragmentary reports coming through the base-wide system. What she heard made her increasingly concerned about the missile defense system's ability to handle the developing situation. The incoming aircraft were using electronic warfare tactics that degraded radar effectiveness, creating exactly the kind of signal environment that her software's advanced algorithms were designed to handle. But the standard operating procedures called for manual verification of all threat data, which would slow response time significantly when dealing with multiple simultaneous targets under electronic warfare conditions. Davies, she said urgently, the interference patterns they're describing are exactly what the automated threat assessment protocols were designed to handle. If the operators try to manually verify everything under these conditions, response time will be too slow. Davies looked up from his security procedures checklist. Elaine, our people are trained for this. The system has multiple redundancies, and our operators know how to function under electronic warfare conditions. But Elaine knew something that Davies didn't. The training scenarios had never included the specific combination of multi-vector threats and sophisticated electronic interference that seemed to be developing outside. Her months of studying edge cases and developing contingency protocols had prepared her for exactly this kind of situation. But she was locked in a shelter while military personnel dealt with threats using procedures that weren't optimized for the current scenario. The radio chatter grew more intense. She heard references to degraded radar picture, multiple simultaneous tracks, and targeting solution delays. Each phrase confirmed her growing certainty that the standard procedures were inadequate for the developing situation. 30 seconds. To missile engagement envelope, came a voice through the communication system. Targeting computers showing multiple conflicts. Request manual verification on all tracks. Manual verification. Elaine's heart sank. Under the electronic warfare conditions being described, manual verification could add critical seconds to response. Time, seconds that could mean the difference between successful interception and catastrophic failure. "Davies, they're making a mistake," she said, moving toward the communication console. "The system is designed to handle exactly these conditions. Automatically. The manual verification protocol will slow response time below acceptable thresholds. Elaine, you need to stay calm. Our people know what they're doing." But the radio communication suggested otherwise. She could hear growing uncertainty in the voices, operators struggling with degraded displays and conflicting data. The sophisticated threat environment was pushing the human operators beyond their training, while the automated systems that could handle it remained underutilized because of procedural requirements. Multiple target acquisition failure, came another report. Targeting solution degraded by electronic interference. Unable to confirm hostile intent on all tracks. Elaine realized that her worst-case scenario was developing in real time. The missile defense system was capable of handling the current threat, but human operators were struggling with decision-making under conditions that exceeded their training parameters. Meanwhile, she sat in a shelter, possessing knowledge that could resolve the crisis, but lacking authority to act on it. The moment had arrived when all her preparation, all her study of edge cases and contingency protocols, could make the difference between success and failure. But she was officially just a visiting contractor, locked away from the action while trained military personnel struggled with problems she knew how to solve. The underground command center at RAF Fairford had transformed into a hub of controlled chaos as the crisis escalated. Banks of monitors displayed degraded radar images. Operators worked frantically to maintain tracking solutions, and the missile defense console that Elaine had helped design sat at the center of it all. Its sophisticated algorithms underutilized while human operators struggled with manual procedures. Flight Lieutenant Chen stood at the primary tactical display, her voice tense as she coordinated with multiple radar stations. Heathrow Control reports 4 unidentified aircraft maintaining course toward London airspace. Electronic interference increasing. We're losing track resolution on multiple targets. Wing Commander Mills surveyed the deteriorating situation from his command position. The threat was unlike anything in their training scenarios, multiple aircraft using sophisticated electronic warfare tactics that degraded traditional radar tracking, while maintaining formation discipline that suggested military rather than civilian origin. "Time to weapons engagement envelope?" Mills asked. 90 seconds at current approach speed, replied Technical Sergeant Rodriguez from the Missile Defense Console. "But sir, we're having difficulty maintaining target locks to the electronic interference. The automated threat assessment system keeps flagging targets, but manual verification protocols require visual confirmation or secondary radar correlation." Mills felt the weight of command decision pressing down on him. The procedures were clear: no weapons launch without positive identification of hostile intent. But the electronic warfare environment made positive identification nearly impossible through standard methods. And time was running out. "Options?" he demanded. "We could attempt radar frequency switching to minimize jamming effects," suggested Chun, "or request fighter intercept for visual identification, but that would require another 8 minutes minimum." 8 minutes they didn't have. Mills stared at the tactical display showing 4 aircraft approaching one of the world's busiest airports, while his most advanced defensive system remained paralyzed by procedural requirements that assumed clearer threat environments. From her position in the civilian shelter, Elaine listened to the increasingly desperate communications with growing frustration. Through the fragmentary radio reports, she could piece together exactly what was happening. The manual verification protocols were failing under electronic warfare conditions, while the automated systems that could handle the situation remained. Unused. She approached Sergeant Davies, who was monitoring the base-wide communications. Davies, they're fighting the system instead of using it. The automated threat assessment protocols can distinguish between civilian and military aircraft even under electronic warfare conditions. The algorithms analyze flight patterns, formation, discipline, and electronic signatures that human operators can't process fast enough. Davies looked up from his radio, his expression mixing concern with protocol awareness. Elaine, I understand you're worried, but our operators are trained for these situations. They'll figure it out. No, they won't, Elaine said with growing urgency. The training scenarios never included this level of electronic warfare sophistication. Combined with multiple simultaneous targets, they're trying to use peacetime procedures in a wartime environment. Through the radio, they heard Rodriguez's voice. Sir, automated system continues to recommend immediate engagement of all 4 targets based on signature analysis, but I cannot confirm hostile intent through manual verification procedures. That was exactly what Elaine had feared. The computer system had already solved the identification problem using algorithms designed specifically for electronic warfare environments. But human operators were required to override the computer's recommendations with manual verification. That was impossible under current conditions. Davies, the system knows they're hostile, Elaine said desperately. The signature analysis algorithms can identify military aircraft by their electronic emissions, flight characteristics, and formation patterns. But the operators don't trust the automated assessment because they've been trained to rely on manual verification. Davies was beginning to understand the magnitude of the problem. Are you saying the computer already knows what they need to know? Yes, but more than that. The system can optimize engagement sequences for multiple simultaneous targets under electronic warfare conditions. It can predict jamming patterns, compensate for signal degradation, and calculate intercept probabilities that no human operator could manage under time pressure. From the radio, 60 seconds to engagement envelope. Still unable to achieve. Manual verification on any targets. Request guidance. Mill's voice crackled through the communication system. Can we trust the automated assessment? Unknown, sir. The system indicates hostile signatures on all targets, but we've never operated under these conditions before. Elaine realized that the crisis had reached the exact point she'd anticipated during her months of preparation. The technology existed to solve the problem, but human operators lacked confidence in systems they didn't fully understand. Meanwhile, time was running out for a decision that could determine whether British airspace was successfully defended or catastrophically penetrated. Davies, she said quietly, I know how to operate that system under these conditions. I've run thousands of simulations of exactly this scenario. The automated protocols can handle it, but someone needs to trust the system and execute the engagement. Sequence properly. Davies stared at her, realizing that the contractor they'd all dismissed as overly curious might possess exactly the expertise needed to resolve the crisis. But she was locked in a civilian shelter while trained military personnel struggled with problems she'd spent months preparing to solve. 30 seconds to engagement envelope, came Rodriguez's increasingly desperate voice. System ready for automated engagement, but manual verification still impossible. Request immediate guidance. The moment of decision was approaching, and Elaine was the only person on base who truly understood how to use the system under the conditions they were facing. But she was officially just a visiting contractor, separated from the action by protocols designed to keep civilians safe while military personnel handled the crisis they'd trained for but never truly experienced. All tracks now within engagement envelope. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communication system, carrying the strain of a man facing an impossible decision. Automated system recommending immediate launch sequence, but I cannot achieve. Manual target verification. Request immediate guidance from command. In the underground shelter, Elaine heard the desperation that marked the breakdown of standard procedures. Through months of simulation training, she'd learned to recognize the moment when human operators reached the limits of their decision-making capacity under extreme stress. That moment had arrived at RAF Fairford. Wing Commander Mills' voice came through the radio, heavy with command responsibility. Rodriguez, what's your assessment of automated system reliability under current conditions? Unknown, sir. The system appears confident, but we've never tested these algorithms under actual electronic warfare conditions. Manual verification remains impossible due to jamming intensity. Elaine turned to Sergeant Davies, her voice urgent but controlled. Davies, they're about to make a catastrophic mistake. Either they'll fail to engage hostile aircraft because they can't verify targets manually, or they'll engage without proper verification and potentially shoot down civilian aircraft. There's a third option, but they don't know how to use it. Davies was monitoring multiple communication channels, trying to maintain situational awareness while keeping the civilian contractors calm. What third option? The automated system can distinguish between civilian and military aircraft using algorithms that analyze electronic signatures, flight characteristics, and formation patterns. But it requires specific operator inputs that aren't covered in standard training. Someone needs to activate the enhanced threat assessment protocols and trust the system to do what it was designed for. From the radio, 15 seconds to engagement decision point. 4 aircraft maintaining approach toward London airspace. Electronic interference preventing standard identification procedures. Mills' voice carried the weight of impossible choices. Rodriguez, can you execute engagement based on automated assessment alone? Sir, that exceeds my training parameters. The manual clearly states that human verification is required for all weapons launches. I'm not qualified to override that protocol. Elaine felt the crisis reaching its breaking point. Rodriguez was a competent operator following established procedures, but those procedures assumed threat environments that didn't match current conditions. The system she'd designed could handle the situation, but only if someone understood how to use its full capabilities. Davies, I need to get to that command center, she said, moving toward the shelter exit. I'm the only person on this base who knows how to operate the system under these conditions. Davies stepped between her and the door. Elaine, I can't let you leave the shelter. Security protocols are absolute during active threats. You're not military personnel, and you don't have authorization for operational areas during combat conditions. Then people are going to die because of security protocols, Elaine replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Either those aircraft will penetrate British airspace and attack London, or we'll shoot down civilian aircraft because we can't tell the difference. The technology exists to prevent both outcomes, but only if someone uses it properly. Davies faced an impossible choice between following security procedures and potentially preventing a catastrophe. His training was clear. Civilian contractors must be secured during active threats. But his growing understanding of the situation suggested that this particular civilian might possess critical capabilities that military personnel lacked. 10 seconds to engagement decision point. Rodriguez's voice carried pure desperation. Request immediate authorization for automated engagement or clearance to allow aircraft to pass. Mills' response revealed the impossible position of command. Rodriguez, I cannot authorize weapons launch without positive target identification, but I also cannot authorize unknown aircraft to penetrate London airspace. The radio fell silent, except for static. marking the moment when established procedures failed to provide adequate guidance for the situation they faced. Somewhere above them, 4 aircraft continued their approach while the most sophisticated missile defense system in the world remained paralyzed by human uncertainty about its own capabilities. Elaine realized that this was the moment she'd been preparing for without knowing it. All her months of study, simulation, and preparation had led to this, a crisis that required someone to bridge the gap between technological capability and human decision-making under impossible pressure. "Davies," she said quietly, "in about 30 seconds, those aircraft will either attack London or will shoot down civilian planes. I can prevent both outcomes, but only if I can reach that command center. What's more important, following protocols or saving lives?" Davies stared at her, seeing not the civilian contractor who'd been dismissed as overly curious, but someone who might possess exactly the expertise needed to resolve an impossible situation. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate communications as operators struggled with decisions that exceeded their training parameters. "Rodriguez, this is Mills. Prepare for emergency protocols. We're going to have to make a decision based on available information." Elaine heard the resignation in Mills' voice, the acceptance that they would have to choose between 2 unacceptable alternatives, because their procedures couldn't handle the complexity of the actual threat environment. "Davies, please," she said, her hand on the shelter door. "Let me help them." Davies looked at his radio, at the security protocols that defined his responsibilities, and at the woman who might be the only person capable of preventing a disaster. The moment of choice had arrived, not just for the operators in the command center, but for everyone who would have to live with the consequences of decisions made in the next few seconds. Through the radio, they heard the sound of aircraft engines, growing louder, marking the final approach of whatever was heading toward London, while the defenders struggled with impossible choices and inadequate procedures. Davies made his decision in the space between heartbeats, stepping aside from the shelter door with a look that acknowledged he was about to violate every security protocol in his training manual. "Though," he said simply, "I'll handle the consequences." Later, Elaine burst from the civilian shelter into the controlled chaos of a military base under active threat. Personnel moved with urgent purpose between buildings. Aircraft engines screamed overhead as fighters scrambled for intercept, and emergency vehicles positioned themselves for potential crisis response. She ran toward the underground command center, her visitor's badge meaningless in a situation where minutes could determine the fate of London. The security checkpoint at the command center entrance presented her first obstacle. Corporal Jenkins stood at his post, following protocols that required him to deny access to all non-essential personnel during active threats. "Ma'am, you need to return to the civilian shelter immediately," he said, moving to block her path. "No exceptions during active operations." "Jenkins, the missile defense system is about to fail because the operators don't know how to use it properly," Elaine said, not slowing down. "I'm the software designer. I know how to fix this. Ma'am, I have direct orders. No civilians in operational areas during combat conditions." Elaine could hear the radio communications from the command center growing more desperate with each passing second. Rodriguez was requesting permission to either engage or stand down, while Mills struggled with decisions that required technical knowledge no one in the command center possessed. "Jenkins, in 30 seconds you're going to watch London get attacked. Because you followed regulations instead of doing what was necessary," she said, then made a choice that would define the rest of her career. She walked around him toward the command center entrance. "Ma'am, stop," Jenkins called, but Elaine was already through the security door, leaving him with the choice of using physical force against a civilian contractor or allowing a massive security breach during active operations. The command center was a symphony of controlled crisis when Elaine entered. Multiple operators worked frantically at their stations while the large Tactical display showed 4 aircraft tracks approaching London airspace. At the center of it all, Rodriguez stood at the missile defense console, his hands poised over controls he wasn't authorized to use without verification he couldn't obtain. 5 seconds to final engagement opportunity, he announced, his voice tight with stress. System ready for automated launch sequence, but manual verification impossible due to electronic warfare conditions. Wing Commander Mills stood behind him, facing the impossible choice between allowing unknown aircraft to reach London or launching missiles without proper target identification. Every second of delay reduced intercept probability while increasing the risk of civilian casualties if the decision proved wrong. Elaine moved directly to the missile defense console, her presence causing immediate confusion among the operators. Rodriguez, step aside. I can operate the system under these conditions. Ma'am, you're not authorized to be here, Mills said sharply, finally noticing her arrival. Security, remove this contractor immediately. Sir, the automated threat assessment. Protocols can identify those aircraft as hostile with 97% certainty, Elaine said, her hands already moving over the console interface. The system is designed to function under exactly these electronic warfare conditions, but the operators need to trust the algorithms and execute the proper sequence. Rodriguez looked between Mills and Elaine, recognizing that someone who understood the system better than he did had just offered to resolve his impossible situation. Sir, she's the software developer. If anyone knows how to make this work, double quotes. Absolutely not, Mills replied. Remove her immediately. But Elaine was already accessing the advanced threat assessment protocols that weren't covered in standard operator training. Her fingers moved with practiced precision through menu systems that most operators had never seen, activating algorithms designed for exactly the electronic warfare environment they currently faced. System analyzing target signatures, she announced, watching as her software processed electronic emissions, flight patterns, and formation characteristics that human operators couldn't evaluate under time pressure. All 4 aircraft showing military signatures consistent with hostile intent. Electronic warfare equipment active. Formation discipline indicates coordinated attack profile. The tactical display updated with detailed threat assessments that provided the verification Mills needed but couldn't obtain through standard procedures. For the first time since the crisis began, they had definitive identification of the approaching aircraft as genuine threats rather than civilian aircraft with navigation problems. Target identification confirmed, Elaine continued, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what she was doing. System ready for optimized engagement sequence against multiple simultaneous targets under electronic warfare conditions. Mills stared at the display, showing threat data that his trained operators hadn't been able to generate. The woman he'd ordered to limit herself to basic technical support was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded those of his entire operational staff. Ma'am, step away from that console immediately, he commanded, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Sir, engagement window closing in 10 seconds, Rodriguez announced. If we're going to act, it has to be now. Elaine's hands hovered over the launch controls, waiting for authorization that might never come. She'd violated every protocol to reach this moment, but the final decision belonged to the commanding officer who would be held responsible for whatever happened. Next, the radio crackled with an urgent update. Aircraft now over outer London suburbs. Final engagement opportunity in 5 seconds. Mills faced the ultimate command decision. Trust the civilian contractor who'd violated every security protocol to reach this moment, or accept responsibility for whatever happened when unknown aircraft reached the heart of London with defensive systems that couldn't function properly under the conditions they faced. The tactical display in the command center showed a scene that would have been impossible to imagine an hour earlier, a civilian contractor with her Hands on the missile defense controls while trained military personnel watched in stunned silence. Every protocol had been shattered, every chain of command violated. Yet Elaine Thompson was the only person in the room who could operate the system under the conditions they faced. 3 seconds to final engagement opportunity, Rodriguez announced. His voice barely controlled. The stress of watching a civilian handle responsibilities that exceeded his own training was visible on his face. But the alternative was accepting failure when success was within reach. Wing. Commander Mills stared at the threat assessment data that Elaine's software was generating. Detailed analysis of electronic signatures, flight patterns, and tactical formations that provided the target identification his operators couldn't achieve. For months, he dismissed her as an overly curious contractor who didn't understand military operations. Now she was demonstrating capabilities that surpassed those of his entire operational staff. "Ma'am, I need your assessment," he said, the words carrying the weight of command decision that could affect thousands of lives. "Can you guarantee those are hostile aircraft?" Elaine's eyes never left the display as algorithms processed data at speeds no human could match. "Sir, signature analysis indicates military aircraft using active electronic warfare systems. Formation, discipline, and approach vectors are consistent with coordinated attack profile. Confidence level 97% hostile intent." The certainty in her voice contrasted sharply with the uncertainty that had paralyzed military decision-making. For the past several minutes, while trained operators struggled with degraded information and procedural limitations, Elaine's software was providing exactly the verification that commanders needed. "Engagement window closing," Rodriguez announced. "System ready for immediate launch on your authorization." Mills faced the ultimate test of command judgment. Trust the civilian contractor who'd violated every security protocol to reach this moment, or accept responsibility for allowing potentially hostile aircraft to penetrate London airspace while defensive systems remained paralyzed by procedural requirements. From the base communication system came an urgent update. London control reports 4 military aircraft now over outer suburbs, maintaining formation, refusing all communication attempts. Estimated time to city center, 90 seconds. The radio transmission crystallized the stakes. Whatever those aircraft intended, they would reach the heart of London while the world's most sophisticated missile defense system remained unable to function because human operators couldn't verify what computer algorithms had already determined. "Ma'am," Mills said quietly, "if you're wrong about this... "Sir, if I'm wrong, I'll accept full responsibility," Elaine replied, her hands steady on the controls despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "But if we do nothing and those aircraft attack London, we'll all share responsibility for failing to use available capabilities when it mattered most." The command center fell silent except for the electronic hum of systems and the distant sound of aircraft engines overhead. Every person in the room understood that they were witnessing a moment that would define careers, change protocols, and possibly determine whether British airspace could be successfully defended against sophisticated threats. Mills looked around. The command center had operators who'd been unable to resolve the crisis despite their training and experience. Then he looked at the civilian contractor who'd somehow acquired capabilities that exceeded those of military personnel, violated every security protocol to reach this moment, yet was offering to accept full responsibility for the consequences of her actions. "Rodriguez, transfer authorization to... He paused, realizing he was about to authorize a civilian contractor to launch military weapons. "Transfer console control to Ms. Thompson." The words hung in the air like the echo of a decision that would reverberate far beyond the current crisis. Rodriguez stepped aside, officially transferring weapons control to someone whose visitor's badge marked her as a temporary presence on base, not a qualified operator of lethal military systems. Elaine's hands moved with practiced precision through the engagement sequence. activating algorithms that optimized missile trajectories for multiple, simultaneous targets under electronic warfare conditions. The system responded with mechanical efficiency, calculating intercept courses and launch timings that no human operator could have managed under the time pressure they faced. 4 missiles away, she announced, watching as the tactical display showed interceptor tracks converging on the incoming aircraft. Estimated intercept in 45 seconds. The command center waited in tense silence as missiles streaked toward targets that represented either genuine threats to London or the most catastrophic mistake in the history of British air defense. The next minute would determine whether Elaine Thompson was a hero who'd saved thousands of lives or a civilian contractor who'd violated every protocol to launch weapons against potentially innocent aircraft. From the speakers came the voice of a fighter pilot who'd been scrambling to intercept. "Command, this is Eagle 1. I have visual contact with the lead aircraft. Confirming military configuration, weapons visible. These are definitely hostile aircraft." The visual confirmation validated everything Elaine's software had determined through electronic analysis. The algorithms had been correct, the threat assessment accurate, and the engagement decision justified by evidence that human operators couldn't have obtained in time. "Impact in 10 seconds, Elaine announced, watching the tactical display as missiles closed with their targets. Around her, the command center held its collective breath while London waited for an outcome that would determine whether innovative thinking could overcome procedural limitations. When lives hung in the balance. The first missile impact registered on the tactical display at 14:47. A brief flash of light, followed by the disappearance of the lead aircraft track from radar. In the command center, operators watched in stunned silence as Elaine's engagement sequence unfolded with mechanical precision, each interceptor finding its target with accuracy that validated months of algorithm development and split-second decision-making under impossible pressure. "Target 1 destroyed," Rodriguez announced, his voice mixing relief with disbelief. "Target 2... impact confirmed. Target 3 destroyed." The fourth and final missile strike eliminated the last aircraft, just as it reached the outer boundaries of central London airspace. What had begun as a potential catastrophe involving unknown aircraft penetrating British airspace ended with a perfect 4-4 intercept rate that demonstrated the missile defense system's capabilities under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Wing Commander Mills stared at the tactical display showing clear airspace, where minutes earlier 4 potentially hostile aircraft had posed an existential threat to London. The woman he'd ordered to restrict her activities to basic technical support had just executed a flawless defensive engagement that his trained operators couldn't have accomplished using standard procedures. "Confirm all hostile aircraft destroyed," came the voice of Eagle 1, the fighter pilot who'd been racing to intercept. "I can see debris patterns from all 4 impacts. Whatever those aircraft were planning, they're not doing it anymore." The RADIO transmission provided final confirmation that Elaine's software had correctly identified genuine threats and eliminated them before they could reach their intended targets. The algorithms that military personnel had been reluctant to trust had proven more reliable than human assessment under electronic warfare conditions. Flight Lieutenant Chun approached the missile defense console where Elaine still stood, her hands steady despite having just made decisions that affected the security of the entire United Kingdom. "Ms. Thompson, how did you know the automated assessment was reliable?" "Our training emphasized human verification for exactly these situations." Elaine finally stepped back from the console, allowing the magnitude of what had just occurred to settle over the command center. The algorithms were designed specifically for electronic warfare environments where human verification becomes impossible. The system analyzes electronic signatures, flight characteristics, and tactical patterns that human operators can't process under time pressure. She gestured toward the tactical display, still showing the intercept data. The software identified military aircraft based on their electronic emissions, recognized coordinated attack patterns from their formation discipline, and calculated optimal engagement sequences for multiple simultaneous targets. But it required operator inputs that aren't covered in standard training, because military doctrine assumes human verification will always be possible. Rodriguez examined the engagement data with professional curiosity mixed with embarrassment. "Ma'am, I've been operating this system for 8 months, and I never knew these capabilities existed." "That's not your fault," Elaine replied. The advanced protocols were designed for edge cases that planners hoped would never occur. The training focused on standard threat environments, not electronic warfare scenarios that exceed human decision-making capacity. Mills approached the console, his expression reflecting the complex emotions of a commander who just witnessed a civilian contractor demonstrate capabilities that exceeded those of his entire military staff. "Miss Thompson, what you just did was extraordinary, but it was also completely unauthorized. You violated every security protocol we have." "Yes, sir," Elaine acknowledged. "I understood the consequences when I left the civilian shelter. But I also understood that standard procedures were failing under conditions the system was designed to handle." The base communication system crackled with updates from London. Air traffic control confirming that the threat had been eliminated, and normal flight operations could resume. Emergency services reported no civilian casualties from missile debris, and fighter aircraft confirmed no additional threats in UK airspace. Major Patricia Walsh, the base security officer, entered the command center with an expression that mixed professional concern with grudging respect. "Miss Thompson, you've created the most significant security breach in this base's history, but you've also apparently prevented what could have been a devastating attack on London." The contradiction captured the essence of what had just occurred. A civilian contractor had violated every protocol designed to maintain security and chain of command, yet had accomplished something that military personnel couldn't achieve using authorized procedures. The success made the breach impossible to dismiss, but the breach made the success impossible to officially approve. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly, "I want to apologize for not trusting the system capabilities you designed. If I'd understood what the software could do. You followed your training," Elaine interrupted. "The problem wasn't operator error, it was inadequate training for scenarios that exceeded standard parameters. The system worked exactly as designed, but only when someone understood how to use its full capabilities." As reports continued to flow in confirming the successful elimination of the threat, the command center began to process the implications of what had just occurred. A civilian contractor had demonstrated military capabilities that exceeded those of trained personnel, had violated security protocols to prevent a potential catastrophe, and had proven that innovative thinking could overcome procedural limitations. When lives were at stake, the immediate crisis was over, but the larger questions it raised about military doctrine, civilian expertise, and the relationship between technology and human decision-making were just beginning to emerge. The debriefing room at RAF Fairford felt more like a courtroom than a military conference facility when Elaine entered at 0800 the following morning. Seated around the polished table were Wing Commander Mills, Major Walsh, Flight Lieutenant Chen, and 2 officers she didn't recognize, Colonel James Harrison from RAF Command and Group Captain Rebecca Stone from the Ministry of Defense. The night had been sleepless for everyone involved. While London celebrated the successful defense of British airspace, military leadership grappled with the unprecedented situation of a civilian contractor who'd violated every security protocol yet prevented what intelligence services had confirmed was a coordinated terrorist attack using stolen military aircraft. "Ms. Thompson," Colonel Harrison began, consulting a thick folder of reports, "yesterday's events have created a situation unlike anything in modern military history. You acted without authorization, violated multiple security protocols, and assumed control of lethal weapon systems during active combat operations. Elaine sat straight in her chair, her hands folded calmly, despite knowing that her career, her security clearance, and possibly her freedom hung in the balance. Yes, sir. I understood the consequences of my actions when I made them. However, Harrison continued, those same unauthorized actions resulted in the successful elimination of 4 hostile aircraft that intelligence services have now confirmed were planning to attack multiple targets in central London. Preliminary estimates suggest your intervention prevented thousands of casualties. Group Captain Stone leaned forward, her expression reflecting the complexity of judging actions that were simultaneously inexcusable and essential. Ms. Thompson, help us understand your decision-making process. What made you believe you were qualified to override military personnel and assume control of weapon systems? Elaine had spent the night preparing for this question, knowing that her answer would determine how her actions were officially characterized. Ma'am, I wasn't trying to override military personnel. I was trying to enable them to use capabilities that the system possessed but that standard training hadn't covered. She gestured toward the tactical reports spread across the table. The missile defense system was designed to function under exactly the electronic warfare conditions we faced yesterday. But the operators had been trained for scenarios that assumed human verification would always be possible. When that assumption proved false, standard procedures became inadequate. Major Walsh consulted her security breach investigation report. Ms. Thompson, our review shows that you'd been studying military operations far beyond your assigned role for months. Some personnel interpreted this as inappropriate ambition or potential security concern. The system I helped design was intended to protect British airspace, Elaine replied. I believed that understanding how it would be used in real scenarios was essential to ensuring it would function properly when needed. Yesterday proved that assumption correct. Wing Commander Mills spoke for the first time since the debriefing began. Ms. Thompson, what you accomplished yesterday was remarkable, but it raises fundamental questions about civilian authority in military operations. How do we maintain chain of command if contractors decide independently when to override established procedures? The question struck to the heart of military discipline and civilian control of armed forces. Elaine recognized that her answer would influence not just her own fate, but potentially the relationship between civilian expertise and military authority in future crisis situations. Sir, I didn't override military authority. Wing Commander Mills made the decision to transfer console control to me. I provided expertise that enabled command decisions, but the authorization to engage came from military leadership. Colonel Harrison reviewed the communication transcripts from the crisis. The record shows that Wing Commander Mills authorized your actions only after you'd already violated security protocols to reach the command center. You essentially forced a situation where military leadership had to choose between court-martialing you and allowing London to be attacked. Yes, sir, Elaine acknowledged. I forced a decision between following procedures and achieving mission success. I believed then, and believe now, that mission success was more important than procedural compliance. The room fell silent as the officers processed her response. In any normal situation, placing mission objectives above procedural compliance would be grounds for immediate dismissal and potential criminal charges. But yesterday's situation had been far from normal, and the results spoke for themselves. Group Captain Stone consulted intelligence reports about the prevented attack. Ms. Thompson, preliminary assessment suggests the aircraft you intercepted were carrying enough explosives to destroy several city blocks. The death toll from a successful attack could have exceeded anything Britain has experienced since World War II. The magnitude of what had been prevented hung heavy in the room. Elaine's unauthorized actions had violated every protocol designed to maintain military discipline, But those same actions had saved thousands of lives and prevented a national catastrophe. However, Harrison continued, we cannot ignore the precedent this creates. If civilian contractors begin making independent decisions about when to violate security protocols, military discipline becomes meaningless. Flight Lieutenant Chun, who'd witnessed the entire crisis, spoke carefully. Sir, if I may, Ms. Thompson didn't act independently. She identified a capability gap that our standard procedures couldn't address and provided expertise that enabled successful mission completion. Without her intervention, we would have failed. The admission from a military officer that civilian expertise had been essential to mission success added another layer of complexity to an already unprecedented situation. The traditional boundaries between civilian support and military operations had been shattered by technological realities that existing protocols hadn't anticipated. Major. Walsh closed her investigation folder. The security breach was unprecedented, but so was the threat environment and the successful response. This case challenges every assumption we make about civilian roles in military operations. Colonel Harrison looked directly at Elaine. Ms. Thompson, the question we face is whether you're a security risk who happened to be right, or a valuable asset whose expertise we've been underutilizing. That determination will affect not just your future, but how the military approaches civilian contractor relationships going forward. The reckoning was complete, but the verdict remained uncertain. Elaine had proven her capabilities beyond any doubt, but she'd also demonstrated a willingness to violate fundamental military protocols when she believed circumstances justified it. The officers faced a decision that would define the relationship between civilian expertise and military authority in an era when technological complexity increasingly exceeded traditional role boundaries. 6 months after the crisis that had shattered every protocol at RAF Fairford, Elaine Thompson stood in the same command center where she'd once been dismissed as an overly curious contractor. But everything had changed. The visitor's badge had been replaced by a permanent security clearance, and the experimental missile defense system now bore a brass nameplate reading, Thompson Advanced Threat Assessment Protocol. The transformation hadn't been immediate or simple. Colonel Harrison's review board had spent 3 weeks deliberating before reaching a conclusion that redefined civilian roles in military operations. Rather than court-martial or dismissal, Elaine had received an unprecedented appointment as Senior Technical Advisor for Advanced Defense Systems, a newly created position that acknowledged the reality of modern warfare. Technological complexity sometimes exceeded traditional military expertise. System status report, she requested from the console operator. Flight Sergeant Michael Davies, the former security escort who'd been promoted after demonstrating exceptional judgment during the crisis. All systems operational, ma'am, Davies replied with a respect that had replaced the polite dismissal of months past. Advanced threat assessment protocols are active and integrated with standard procedures. Operators report high confidence in automated systems. The integration had been the most challenging aspect of the transformation. Military personnel had needed to learn to trust algorithmic assessments that exceeded human analytical capability, while maintaining the command authority essential to military discipline. Elaine had developed training programs that taught operators when to rely on automated systems and when human judgment remained essential. Wing Commander Mills approached the console, his relationship with Elaine now characterized by professional respect rather than skeptical tolerance. Ms. Thompson, we've received authorization for the advanced training exercise. Multiple aircraft, electronic warfare environment, coordinated threat scenario. Excellent, Elaine replied, reviewing the exercise parameters on her display. This will test the new protocols under conditions similar to what we faced 6 months ago, but with operators who understand the system's full capabilities. The exercise was part of an ongoing program to ensure that what had happened in the real crisis would never again require unauthorized actions to achieve mission success. Military personnel now trained specifically for scenarios where human verification became impossible and automated systems provided the only reliable threat assessment. Flight Lieutenant Chun, now serving as Deputy Operations Commander, joined them at the console. "Ma'am, the new training protocols have reduced average response time by 30% while maintaining 100% accuracy in threat identification. The integration of automated and human decision-making is working exactly as designed." The success metrics validated Elaine's months of work to rebuild military procedures around technological capabilities rather than forcing technology to conform to outdated human limitations. The missile defense system now functioned as originally intended, with human operators and automated systems working in concert rather than in conflict. "Begin exercise sequence," Elaine announced, watching as operators implemented procedures that combined the best of human judgment with the speed and accuracy of algorithmic analysis. The command center buzzed with efficient activity as personnel executed protocols that had been impossible 6 months earlier. The exercise unfolded flawlessly. Simulated aircraft using electronic warfare tactics that had once paralyzed human operators were quickly identified and tracked by automated systems, while human personnel made engagement decisions based on reliable data rather than degraded information. Response times met optimal parameters while maintaining the verification standards essential to preventing civilian casualties. "Exercise complete," Chun announced. "All targets successfully identified and engaged within acceptable time windows. No procedural violations, no unauthorized actions required." The success marked the completion of a transformation that extended far beyond RAF Fairford. Elaine's actions during the crisis had catalyzed a fundamental reevaluation of how military organizations utilize civilian expertise, integrated advanced technology, and adapted procedures to meet evolving threats. As the exercise concluded, Elaine reflected on the journey from dismissed contractor to essential team member. The whisper campaigns about her excessive curiosity had been replaced by requests for her input on operational planning. The concerns about her boundary-crossing preparation had evolved into recognition that modern threats required exactly that kind of comprehensive expertise. Her transformation had created ripple effects throughout the base and beyond. Technical. Sergeant Rodriguez had completed advanced training in algorithmic threat assessment. Major Walsh had developed new security protocols that balanced protection with operational flexibility. Even Colonel Harrison had become an advocate for integrating civilian expertise into military operations when technological complexity exceeded traditional role boundaries. The afternoon briefing included personnel from multiple bases who were implementing similar transformations in their own defensive systems. Elaine's unauthorized actions had proven that innovative thinking could overcome procedural limitations, but more importantly, they demonstrated that military effectiveness required adaptation to technological realities rather than rigid adherence to outdated protocols. "Ms. Thompson," Mills said as the briefing concluded, "I owe you an apology. 6 months ago, I saw your preparation and expertise as exceeding appropriate boundaries. I now realize you were preparing for exactly the kind of scenario that eventually occurred. Sir, you were following established procedures and maintaining appropriate security," Elaine replied. The problem wasn't with individual decisions, but with a system that hadn't adapted to technological capabilities that exceeded traditional role definitions. As evening approached, Elaine stood once again at the edge of RAF Fairford, watching aircraft conduct training exercises in the same airspace where hostile aircraft had once threatened London. But now the base operated with integrated human automated procedures that could respond effectively to any threat scenario, whether conventional or unprecedented. The transformation was complete, but the larger implications continued to evolve. Military organizations worldwide were studying the RAF Fairford incident as a model for integrating civilian expertise, adapting procedures to technological capabilities, and maintaining effectiveness in threat environments that exceeded traditional parameters. Elaine's journey from base visitor to essential team member had proven that expertise and preparation could overcome institutional limitations when stakes were high enough to force adaptive change. The woman they'd once called just a visitor had become the architect of defensive capabilities that would protect British airspace for decades to come. Her story had become required reading at military academies, not as an example of acceptable protocol violation, but as a demonstration of how innovative thinking and thorough preparation could enable mission success when conventional approaches proved inadequate. The missile defense system hummed quietly in the background, its algorithms continuously monitoring British airspace with capabilities that no human operator could match, guided by procedures that no traditional military doctrine could have anticipated, operated by personnel who understood that modern defense required the best of both human judgment and technological capability. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.